special edition of the Gramophone Podcast, in which we will focus on the music of Mozart. I'm Martin Cullingford, editor of Gramophone, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Richard Wigmore, an expert on the music of Mozart and someone we're incredibly fortunate to have regularly sharing his knowledge and insight in the pages of the magazine. Richard, thank you for joining us.
Great pleasure.
Now, we have just published a special collector's edition called Gramophone Presents Mozart, in which we have drawn together some of the most fascinating, thought-provoking and inspiring articles about Mozart's music from the magazine's almost century-long archive. Several of the more recent ones are by you, Richard, so I thought I'd begin by asking you to set the context a little. We know Mozart was an extraordinary child prodigy. He started writing works we still admire today at a remarkably young age, and then, across really a decade or so, composed some of the most wonderful works in all music history, in almost all genres, before dying tragically young in 1791, aged just 35. Perhaps you could add some narrative to that basic framework. What were the main episodes or key turning points that help us understand Mozart as a person? Where did this genius come from?
Yes, I think first of all we have a look at Leopold Mozart, Mozart's father. I mean, he was an impressive man, not an easy man, Leopold Mozart. I think he had a charm and tact bypass, but he was a fine musician. He wrote the definitive 18th century treatise on violin playing the very year that Mozart was born, 1756, and he called Wolfgang the miracle that God let be born in Salzburg. Yeah, genius. I mean, how do you account for it? Mozart certainly had the best possible early training from his father. Hyper-intensive childhood. You'd probably call it child abuse these days. Trawled around Europe, bumpy roads, freezing conditions, backwards and forwards across the Alps when he was in his teens. Not happy that. Mozart, from the age of 5, 6, was already composing. He was, with a little bit of help from Dad, I think it's fair to say. He was a born musical mimic, absorbing the lingua franca of the day, high-class blotting paper. So those early works he wrote from the age of 5 till his early teens. I don't think there's anything distinctive. I think there's a danger of us overrating Mozart's very, very early works, simply because they have the Mozart moniker attached to them. I'm not sure who could honestly say, with a work, a little piano piece, say, of Mozart's composed age 6, 7, or his first few symphonies, this has got to be by Mozart. This is the composer of Don Giovanni and the Jupiter Symphony in embryo. I think we can be wise after the event here. But Mozart was brilliant at reproducing to a very acceptable professional level by the time he was 8, 9, 10. What was on everyone else's lips. He could say just as well, or almost as well as his much, much older contemporaries.
And that would have been, I suppose, really part of his education, development of his voice, just an ability to immerse himself in everything that was happening musically then, so that he could then take it on to the next stage.
Yes, absolutely. The 3 Italian journeys that he undertook, the first one in 1771 to 1772. No, sorry, the first one, 1769 to 1770, that's right. Culminating in the triumphant premiere of his opera Mithridate in Milan. The first of his 3 operatic journeys introduced him firsthand to the Italian musical world. Italy, undoubtedly the centre of opera in those days. And Mozart, you feel, was a born operatic animal. And the combination of Mozart's own dramatic instincts and his encounter with Italy and Italian opera composers, the Italian opera public, Italian opera singers, not least indeed, was a huge stage in his development towards the supreme opera composer, for many people the greatest opera composer of all time. First manifested in Idomeneo in 1781.
Looking back from the perspective of a quarter of a millennium later, there is a danger that we see great figures like Mozart in too much isolation. But as you say, of course, Mozart was working within a rich musical and cultural world. Can you give us a sense of what the musical life Mozart found himself in for a large part of his life was like? Who were some of his key contemporaries, and how would they have either influenced or indeed been influenced by Mozart?
Yes. Well, the first here, we're talking really Mozart's childhood visits to London in 1764, 1765. Johann Christian Bach, J.S. Bach's youngest son, high-class purveyor of the galant style, smooth, rounded cantabile melodies, an absolutely crucial early influence. He's also a kind man. Mozart spoke very warmly of him in later life. He took the young Mozart to some degree under his wing, Johann Christian Bach, so he was a key influence. Johann Christian Bach's music, for example, never sounds like Haydn's, but it can sometimes sound like Mozart's. Vocal melody, yeah, especially it was a key factor in J.C. Bach's style, and suavity, grace, symmetry. Mozart couldn't avoid Gluck. He met Gluck several times in Vienna. Gluck definitely was the preeminent opera composer in the generation before Mozart. There was Gemelli, there was Traetta as well, but Gluck and his reform operas, Alceste, the two Iphigénia operas premiered in Paris, absolutely crucial there. We know that Gluck went to at least one of Mozart's concerts in Vienna, invited him for lunch. Not everybody was invited to the Gluck. Gluck was retired in Vienna by this stage, but Alceste especially, I would say, was a key influence on Idomeneo, but you feel Mozart, the born competitor, knew that in some ways he could outdo Gluck, not least in harmonic imagination.
So at what point do you think Mozart was aware that his own distinct voice was developing? And where in terms of his works can we see the point where we've gone from what you described before as interesting and competent young works and actually Mozartian works?
Yes, so from the highly gifted mimic to the original creator you're talking about here, aren't you?
Yes.
Yes, I think everybody would nominate a different first work of Mozart in which we could unmistakably say this has to be Wolfgang. It can't be Dittersdorf, it can't be J.C. Bach, it can't be Van Hal, it can't, For me, Mozart became great in the mid to late 1770s, so round about his 20th, 21st year. One of the earliest works, I guess, must be, though, the A major symphony, the adorable A major symphony K201. Beginning the first scene with the gliding octave leaps and the sustained underlay from the lower strings there. Yeah, that is an absolutely magical opening, and you do feel, and he was 18, yeah, you do feel that is the first glimpse of something absolutely unrepeatable, something unique that could not have been done by anybody else in Mozart's work. But for Mozart to be sort of regularly that distinctive, I think we have to go a few years forward. We've also got the G minor symphony K183, the so-called Little G minor symphony, composed a little bit earlier than that A major symphony. There's something of a Haydn imitation there, but nevertheless, it is possible to hear a distinctive voice. It couldn't be by anybody else again. But I would say we're looking at, above all, the Piano Concerto in E flat. It used to be the Jeunehomme, but it's now Jeunehomme. We've identified the recipient of that word, Mademoiselle Jeunehomme, 1777, composed around the time of Mozart's 21st birthday. And that, with its very original opening, the orchestra comes in with a fanfare, the piano answers, and the interplay between piano and orchestra is on a different plane of subtlety and sophistication and just wit. than any of his earlier concertos or the concertos by anybody else. And then the tragic slow movement in C minor, mining depths of pathos and passion that had not been glimpsed in any of Mozart's earlier music. So I think that work, the Piano Concerto in E flat K271, the Jeunehomme 21st, I mean, Mozart aged 21 had arrived, and from then on he was always likely to produce something breathtaking, something totally individual that could only have the Mozart stamp on it.
And to go back to a point I made about Mozart excelling across pretty much all classical genres, I mean, as I wrote in the introduction to the publication, there are composers who are so central to various genres that it's almost impossible to imagine those areas of music without them. Verdi and Wagner in opera, Bach in sacred music, Schubert in Lieder. But has there been a composer other than Mozart that's covered the whole spectrum of classical music, opera, concertos, sonatas, symphonies and more, quite so supremely?
Yes, it's a good question, that. I mean, Haydn wrote in all those genres, and while Haydn didn't do too badly in oratorio, did he? And that's the one area perhaps that Mozart didn't contribute to. Haydn did very nicely there. But Haydn's operas you would not put on anything like the same level as Mozart. So if we omit oratorio, you can say that Mozart was supreme in all the major genres of the day, in symphony, in concerto, in chamber music, and then some in chamber music, in sacred music with the two, although ironically unfinished, supreme masterpieces, the C minor Mass and the Requiem, and of course in opera. He had all the bases covered.
Yeah. And is it possible to define a Mozartian style or voice that somehow unites this huge and hugely disparate output?
Mozart's style, yes, I've been thinking about that. To sum up Mozart's style, I would say there are 4 words, all beginning with C, that one could use here. The first one, I would say, is cantabile, Mozart and the human voice. We can refer back to Johann Christian Bach here, such an early influence on the child Mozart. Legato melodies that can so often be sung, not least in the piano concertos, which are so often opera by other means. So Mozart, his love of the human voice, he wrote supremely, especially for the soprano voice, a lifelong love affair with the soprano voice. We look forward to Richard Strauss there, but I think also applicable to Mozart, of course, who had personal friendships with so many singers, and he married a pretty good singer as well, Constanze, and his first love was Aloysia Weber, a star soprano there. So cantabile melodies, beautiful singing melodies, more memorable, you can say, than the melodies of comparable other composers of the time. Yeah. He can so often transform prettiness into sublimity in his melodies. That's a subjective judgment, but I think
that's a wonderful way of putting it.
The number of performances he received compared with contemporaries, with the exception of Haydn, of course, I think would confirm that. So the other 3 C's, chromaticism, more than any contemporary, or at least far more regularly than any contemporary, Mozart exploited dissonant, pushed music to levels of dissonant extremes that really did challenge the 18th century ear. Haydn did that occasionally. He did it more often in his very late works after Mozart's death, but in the late 1770s, especially through the 1780s, Mozart was often writing at a level of dissonance unapproached by his contemporaries. The famous, indeed notorious, introduction to the C major string quartet K465, the so-called Dissonant, became a cause célèbre. In France, they thought that Mozart had just made one mistake after another. What was he on when he composed that kind of thing? So the dissonant introduction, yes, but especially in his minor keyed works. I mean, the contorted chromatic opening of the famous piano concerto in C minor, K491. It's interesting, every other opening of Mozart's concertos, the very opening at least, is singable, but that isn't. You hear that, and unless you have a supreme ear, singing it back accurately after hearing it once is a big, big challenge. It is difficult in inverted commas music there. Mozart setting himself and setting his listeners a challenge there. Or the still shocking development sections in the outer movements of the late G minor symphony, K550, number 40. At the beginning of the development of the finale, for example, the tonal system sort of breaks down. There's a crash into chaos. The first few bars, the beginning of the development section. It's a kind of thing that just would not have occurred to anybody else in 1788. So always pushing boundaries, testing himself, but always with a kind of Olympian control as well. You never feel it is going to spiral into total chaos. And that example I've just given from Symphony No. 40, Mozart gets us back after that moment of utter shock that remains a moment of utter shock. And there's so much chromatic subtlety, especially in his chamber music. I mean, looking at another symphony, the finale of the Jupiter, famous, and we're coming up onto another C in a minute, famous for, of course, for its elaborate fugal weave, but the development and into the recapitulation there again takes dissonance to a point of excruciating pain. For 18th century years, yes, I mean, we've been through the whole atonal world, the Second Viennese School, etc. But imagine, to a hearer in 1788 or even 1850, that level of sustained dissonance, but always done with supreme control and supreme logic.
Yeah, but I think it is important and instructive to put ourselves in the minds of those listeners, just to remember just what a radical, unexpected creative spirit he was, because perhaps the sheer ubiquity of so much of his work now, and of course the fact we're listening with ears that have heard, as you say, the atonal movement since then, it's easy to forget that, I think.
Absolutely, it is indeed. So we come to the third C. We've had cantabile, we've had cantabile, we've had chromaticism, and counterpoint. One of the glories of late Mozart, from the 6 quartets that he dedicated to Haydn onwards, I would suggest, is his use of counterpoint within the classical sonata style, and with no sense of archaic fustian. He had studied the music of Bach and Handel avidly in his early years in Vienna at the home of Baron van Swieten, the imperial court librarian. And he wrote around 1782, 1783 many works, all of them unfinished, incidentally, that do draw on the Bach and Handel style. And the most imposing of these works is the C minor Mass. The parts of the great C minor Mass are supreme Handel pastiche. In one chorus especially, the Qui Tollis, is very strongly indebted to the people shall hear and be afraid from Handel's Israel in Egypt. Inexorable dotted rhythms on the harmonic progressions. And the monumentality of that work is more Handelian, I would say, than Bachian. But Mozart wrote many fugues for keyboard, a fugue for 2 pianos, which he later arranged for strings, and then he added an adagio to the adagio and fugue K426. And that's an example of Bach/Handel pastiche. But far more often, Mozart uses counterpoint subtly, with incredible deftness and resource, to enrich his chamber music from the Haydn quartets he dedicated to Haydn, from that period onwards, sometimes in his piano concertos. The finale, for example, of the F major concerto, K459, is a wonderful fusion of opera buffa and complex counterpoint. Again, you feel that could have occurred to nobody else. Mozart setting himself a challenge and fusing opposites, oil and water. Somehow he makes them blend.
Yes. No, that's wonderful. I think that third one certainly gets us to something in his character as well.
Yes.
Another C, perhaps. But that's not the fourth C that you've got for us.
The fourth C is comedy. Mozart, a writer of arguably the greatest comic operas of all time. A lover of farce and sheer silliness on the one hand. I mean, Cherubino revealed hiding in the chair, first act of Figaro, Despina disguised as a doctor, in the right production, they still make us laugh. But also a broad and deep human sympathy. It is not just farce or slapstick, of course. And, so many of his finales, especially, are comic opera by other means. The Piano Concerto is the most obvious example. The piano, the woodwind, and the strings, three separate groups, jousting, chipping in, undercutting each other. And the woodwind, especially in Mozart's piano concertos, living characters. So we get opera buffa, comedy. Mozart never happier than when he had the whiff of grease paint in his nostrils. And the piano concertos, opera by other means, absolutely. But also quite a lot of the chamber music.
Yeah, and as you say, the comedy, particularly specifically the comedy in the opera, he uses so well to illuminate humanity. If we think of things like the end of the Marriage of Figaro, the whole comedy that you've alluded to in there takes us to something really deep and moving and redemptive.
It does, yes. Well, all of Mozart's mature operas aspire to harmony, reconciliation, a spirit of grace. Don Giovanni, the partial exception. Così fan tutti also perhaps leaves more questions unanswered than answered. But certainly Idomeneo, Die Entführung, Figaro, Tito, and the Magic Flute, so 5 of the last 7 operas, are models really of enlightenment, harmony, with a notion of human perfectibility. And forgiveness is at the core of so many of them. Obviously, very much the example you've just given of the Countess forgiving her philandering husband. Of course, we do know that he's going to be at it again, as we know from the Beaumarchais sequel, La Mère Coupable, the Guilty Mother, which Mozart didn't set, of course. But for the time being, we have to imagine, as we do at the end of the Magic Flute, as we do at the end of Idomeneo, we have to imagine that human perfectibility, a perfectly ordered Enlightenment world. And the ordering, far more often than not in Mozart, of course, comes through the agency of the women. It's the women, it's the Countess and Susanna, it's Pamina in the Magic Flute, it's Ilia in Idomeneo.
That's interesting.
Yes.
Do you think he was very consciously aware of perhaps the different roles that women and men played in society in those days, and how he was trying to communicate something through that understanding?
Yes, it's hard to put one's finger on that definitively. There was a tradition, an 18th century tradition, I'm sure you know, the sentimental novel, the spotless heroine, much put upon. Mozart's heroines, though, while they sometimes are spotless, they go beyond that. They are, well, we might say feisty. They are doers. They are activators. So they're both morally flawless. Ilia in Idomeneo, Pamina, they're spotless. They could be sentimental heroines, except that they're not. Mozart makes them so much more than that, so much more rounded, and so much more mistress of their own destinies. They're not passive sufferers.
Something you've said makes me want to take just a little detour. We've talked very much about Mozart's placed within the context of musical life and his influences and so on. But you talking about how through his work, particularly through his operas, their presentations of Enlightenment thought and understanding, how engaged was he with the wider intellectual and philosophical strands and thoughts of the time? Do we know much about
Yes, well, of course, we do know that he was a Freemason, as indeed was Haydn, a more committed Freemason. From what we know, we don't know exactly how regularly he attended Masonic meetings. He certainly relied on the beneficence of some fellow Freemasons when he was hard up, especially the merchant Michael Puchberg, from whom he borrowed quite large sums, mainly repaid. And of course, Masonry in Joseph II's Vienna Freemasonry, all male, unlike in France, but it was a forum where intellectuals, educated men could meet and discuss issues of the day, discuss politics up to a certain level, I guess. There were certain no-nos there, but aesthetics, music, literature, etc., ideas, at a very fertile period in Europe for new ideas, of course. And Mozart, to some degree, took part in that, but you do feel Mozart was, a composing workaholic, didn't have too much time to immerse himself in matters that were not directly related to his own music making. I don't think you could call either Mozart or Haydn or really Beethoven, maybe Beethoven a little bit more so, an all-round intellectual. They were overwhelmingly, composers, and in Mozart's case, he was an impresario, of course. He was always negotiating with publishers. He was putting on his own concerts. He was, getting subscribers, etc. I mean, he had a great deal to do to keep himself, which he did very successfully, especially in his early years in Vienna, to keep himself successfully afloat as a freelancer. He was, after Handel in London, where it was rather easier, he was the first great composer who went freelance for a substantial part of his adult life.
Interesting.
Yes, Haydn had the Esterházys.
Yeah.
Beethoven after him, yes, but the world had changed by the time Beethoven came on the scene. But Bach relied, totally on,
he had a job.
Ultimately, steady jobs at every period of his adult life.
Yeah.
Handel didn't, and because London was by far the most cosmopolitan and affluent, the largest musical scene, and Handel was able to make his way very handsomely in London. But in Vienna, Mozart, he had never had a court appointment. He never had a church appointment.
Yeah. No, fascinating observation. So to come back to Mozart's music and some of the works that you've already mentioned there, some of the later great operas. One of the most fascinating features in the publication is one by you in which you focus on 1791, Mozart's final year, and the extraordinary works that he wrote in those 12 months. His final Piano Concerto, number 27 K 595, the Magic Flute and the Clemenza di Tito you've mentioned, the Clarinet Concerto, and of course the Requiem. How should we see this year and its works? Obviously it only became a final year with hindsight, but can we see it as the culmination of musical development, or perhaps more accurately a hint of what direction that journey might have taken, or really was it just a usual year by Mozart standards, i.e. an extraordinary one by anyone else's, that's since taken on an understandably tragic meaning?
Yeah, that's a tantalising question, of course, and one that's much asked. I think the first thing we have to say is we shouldn't sentimentalise 1791. Even the Requiem, Mozart began the Requiem early October of 1791. He had no inkling. He had only got 2 months to live when he wrote the Requiem. So, these late works should not be regarded as a farewell to the world. That's also true of the works that Schubert wrote in 1828. Mozart had 2 pretty lean years, certainly by the standards of his glory years of the mid-1780s. 1789 to 1790, the lean years, although not quite as lean as some biographers have made out. But it was a huge upturn in 1791. 3 major commissions, 2 operas, Magic Flute, Clemenza di Tito, and the Requiem, chamber music, public concerts there, Clarinet Concerto, of course, and all of this music in danger of being sentimentalised. The B-flat Piano Concerto K595 and the Clarinet Concerto, they have often been given a very sort of wistful cast in their interpretations, and I think these days performers are much more aware that they are not valediction. Mozart did not intend the Clarinet Concerto to be his last instrumental work. He did not intend the B-flat Piano Concerto to be his last, number 27 Finis. No, he did not intend that. It's very interesting, in earlier centuries, yes, in the 19th and well into the 20th century, the sentimentalizing of Mozart, and the earliest recording, as far as I know, of the B-flat Piano Concerto K595 with Arthur Schnabel as the soloist, takes the second movement, marked Larghetto, at a funereal adagissimo. So slow it's still going on somewhere, and it sums up, I think, the sentimentalizing approach. His last piano concerto. So let's take it. Let's make it last 12 minutes instead of approximately 6 or 7 that we tend to get these days. It's Larghetto. It has a kind of, music has a limpid grace, very similar to some of the music the 3 boys sing in the Magic Flute. Yeah, but that's not the way it was viewed in earlier generations, if Schnabel's recording is anything to go by, for example. There's a characteristic of Mozart's late style, which I would call chaste simplicity. It's both slightly rarefied and also popular in tone. A paradox there, perhaps. We hear that in parts of the Magic Flute, music for the 3 boys especially, but not only for the 3 boys. Parts of Clemenza di Tito, also the andante of the often underrated string quintet, this last chamber work, string quintet in E-flat, K614. The andante there has this mixture of the rarefied and the popular. And of course there's a lustier popular tone in the music of Papageno, and in the first and the last movements of that string quintet, and in the finale of the Clarinet Concerto. Finale of the Clarinet Concerto, think about it, that's the last instrumental music Mozart ever wrote. It bubbles with fun and mischief, doesn't it?
It does.
The clarinet duetting with itself. The clarinet designed to be a soprano 1 second, and a baritone the next, and having a sort of fun dialogue with itself in the finale, for example, and chuckling away, in response to the strings. That is Mozart's last instrumental work. Is that a farewell?
It's full of joy.
Exactly. Full of joy, full of fun, full of mischief. Yeah. We can't underestimate the mischief in Mozart. Of course, that is now, especially with the film and play Amadeus, the mischievous, antic side of Mozart. I'm sure that is hugely exaggerated there. But you read his letters, and there was a mischievous spirit there, wasn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about Mozart on record. Mozart's music has been a central part of the century or so of recording history, and one obvious impact of recording is the immediate availability of his music. Looking through our archives, it's salutary to be reminded that this wasn't always the case. And just by way of example, we reprint in the publication I referred to earlier a review of an Edwin Fischer piano concerto recording, the E-flat concerto K482, which turns out to be as much explanation of the music as discussion of the performance, which is a reminder that for most readers this was unfamiliar music. How would you see the impact of recording on Mozart's music and its popularity, indeed ubiquity, for the modern age? Are we able to identify works whose reputations underwent a revival as a consequence of recording?
Yes, well, recording, of course, has been hugely influential, as it has with Bach, Handel and Haydn, the other three 18th century giants, only a small fraction of whose works was known before World War II, certainly. Maybe we'll just have a quick look, though, at Mozart's reputation in the 19th century. Mozart regarded, at the beginning of the 19th century, and E.T.A. Hoffmann, Tales of fame, was a key player here. He was regarded as a romantic, but as the century progressed, his music became increasingly overshadowed by Beethoven. And then, of course, came Brahms and Wagner and so on. And only a few works survived, post 1840, 1850 in the regular repertoire. The D minor Piano Concerto K466, the most overtly Beethovenian, for which Beethoven indeed wrote cadenzas. Also the Coronation Concerto K537, perhaps the most flashy of Mozart's piano concertos. The Jupiter Symphony, to some extent the G minor K550, and just three operas were in the regular repertoire: Figaro, Giovanni, and the Magic Flute. But the Magic Flute, and to some extent the other two as well, but especially the Magic Flute, was performed usually in drastically reworked versions, sometimes huge travesties, often in Italian. And the other work that was in the repertoire, the Requiem, yes. The quartets and quintets, chamber music, popular among amateurs, because in those days chamber music recitals were pretty rare. Mozart was idealised by many as an emblem of a lost Eden. Tchaikovsky was an example of that, for example, but also patronised. The image of the divinely inspired eternal child with this transcendent facility, with one or two exceptions. Don Giovanni, number one. It was regarded that Mozart lacked gravitas. Beethoven provided that, of course. So this Dresden China image, bloodless classicism, all that kind of thing.
So it does sound like the works that were still in the repertoire were very much those that perhaps were closest to the sensibilities of the Romantic age. So almost they were seeing Mozart through their own sensibilities rather than looking at him in his own right. Yeah,
absolutely, yes, especially the D minor Piano Concerto, Don Giovanni and the Requiem, all D minor, those works, yes. The 19th century liked Mozart in D minor. Because in the 20th, we take Mozart the man and Mozart the musician a lot more seriously in the rowing, complexities, ambivalence, scatological humour, which was sanitised in pre-war editions of his letters, for example. So, the works that have particularly benefited from the age of recording, really we're talking from the 1930s onwards, even more from the 50s onwards. Idomeneo, certainly, among his supreme masterpieces, was regarded as a dusty museum piece. It was revived in a totally Bowdlerized form by Richard Strauss in I think it was 1920, the first Salzburg Festival. But it only really came into its own at Glyndebourne in the 1950s, and the earliest recording, albeit heavily cut, by John Pritchard. So that was definitely a work that became known much, much more through the gramophone. Ditto La Clemenza di Tito, regarded as a period piece, representative of an outmoded genre, opera seria. Così fan tutti, funnily enough, a work again that had been very much sidelined in the 19th century, regarded as too frilly. Music's good, but the plot is so ridiculous and silly and an insult to women, as Wagner thought, that it really was hardly worth performing. And again, Richard Strauss, with some help in the UK from Sir Thomas Beecham, reinstated it on the stage. But it was Glyndebourne again who made the first recording. Well, Glyndebourne Forces made the first recording in 1935. But it was only after the war that regular recordings made così as popular as Figaro, Don Giovanni, and the Magic Flute. But lesser known works even now, I mean, the unfinished Zaida, for example, which was a revelation to me as a student when I acquired a recording made, the recording must have been made in the early 70s, I suppose, by Leopold Hager, and it's in the Philips complete Mozart edition that came out in 1991. The incidental music to the drama König Thamos, another revelation, minor key turbulence there, plus anticipations of the Magic Flute and Don Giovanni. Many of the piano concertos were unknown, virtually unperformed until they came into the limelight through recordings. K449 in E flat, K451 in D major, two examples there.
I guess the very nature of when recording reached a stage where people would record complete cycles of piano concertos, that's when everything by its very nature would start getting more of a revival.
Absolutely, and yes, complete cycles.
And as listeners, we then got to hear more of it.
Complete cycles of Mozart symphonies.
No, absolutely. I mean, recording has also allowed us to follow some of the key changes in the interpretation of Mozart's music. And one of the most significant is, of course, the development of period performance, the attempt to get closer to understanding and even replicating how the music might have been heard in Mozart's day. Such an aim is always revelatory, if necessarily imperfect, but crucially every subsequent artist, whether playing on period instrument or not, has been informed and enriched by it. Can you talk us through some of the key trends and developments in Mozart interpretation as preserved on recording, including that pivotal period performance movement?
Yes. Well, I think the decade of the 1960s and 70s important in that we began to hear Mozart perform with chamber orchestras a lot more, and recordings with, at the forefront, the Academy of St Martin in the Fields under Neville Marriner. Complete cycle of Mozart symphonies made during the 1970s into the early 80s, I think, by the Academy of St Martin in the Fields, contrasting with another complete cycle made by Karl Böhm and the Berlin Philharmonic. Böhm and the Berlin Philharmonic, traditional, large scale, a little bit ponderous perhaps, very, very polished, etc. Mozart seen through a Beethovenian prism to some extent. In the 1970s, the Academy of St Martin in the Fields, state-of-the-art, lighter, smaller forces, so more prominent woodwind, VLE strings.
It's quite extraordinary, isn't it, to think they were going on in similar points of time, given how extraordinarily different they sound.
Absolutely,
in the direction that they look
yes.
in.
But I think a key moment was Alfred Brendel's complete piano concerto cycle made during that decade of the 1970s, where I guess in LP terms everything seemed possible. The world was expanding infinitely, pre-CD of course. His concerto cycle with the Academy of St Martin in the Fields, Neville Marriner again, a sense of, impish glee you got in the best of Brendel's performances, spontaneous sounding embellishments. He wasn't afraid to make the plain places rough. Sense of mischief, sense of fun that was much rarer in earlier recordings. I mean, the classic recordings by the likes of Edwin Fischer, Annie Fischer indeed, made some marvellous recordings with two of them with Adrian Bolt, I remember. Emil Gilels, Rudolf Serkin, and a variable complete cycle made in the 1960s by Geza Under. But Brendel and the Academy of St Martin in the Fields, I think, were something special, something new and special. And we heard things in Mozart that others hadn't really brought out. But then the game changed with the period revolution in the late 70s and then through the 80s. The Mozart Symphony Series from the Academy of Ancient Music, Christopher Hogwood and Jaap Schroeder there. Starker, less first violin dominated, less blended, less suavely polished, higher percentage of wind versus strings, of course, even than the Marriner recordings. And at their best, they were Mozart with a kind of don't mess with me attitude. the prettiness, the suavity, the grace, that side of Mozart, which had been so stressed in earlier generations of performances, had less of a part in the much sort of blunter and yes, unprettified, unsmoothed Mozart from the Academy of Ancient Music. A little bit later, though, Trevor Pinnock, in his complete series of Mozart symphonies, added more cantabile warmth. Yeah. That C word again, yes, cantabile warmth, and more shaping of the music. So, whereas Hogwood gave us the texts, you know, with a kind of rawness and immediacy, they weren't necessarily interpretations. Yeah. Whereas Pinnock, and then after him, or more at the same time actually, the likes of Gardner, Norrington, and then crossing the Channel, Harnoncourt especially, they put a more individual stamp on their interpretations. And then in the concertos, yes, piano concertos, the pioneering series with Malcolm Bilson and John Eliot Gardner evolving from 1984 onwards. A huge rethink there because of the use of the forte piano, a reproduction of an Anton Walter instrument, the kind of instrument that Mozart would have known. And these piano concertos, which by then we all thought we knew, became chamber music with the piano often first among equals. Not always perhaps first as well. Lots of cadential flourishes, you know, going even beyond Brendel in embellishment, in improvisation. The forte piano used as a continuo instrument, following period practice, you know, playing along with the orchestra, and the piano often providing a silvery gloss rather than rampaging in the spotlight. So, you know, they sounded more radically different even than the symphonies did with period instruments because of the forte piano.
So here we are in 2022. Is it possible to define Mozart interpretation today?
That is difficult. I mean, yes, difficult. We're living in a pluralistic age, although you have to say that period instruments overwhelmingly predominate, except still in the sphere of chamber music. Performances of Mozart's string quartets, string quintets, chamber music with piano on period instruments are still rare. It's an interesting question, that. Why? In general, though, Mozart's style today, not very different from Mozart's style 10, 20 years ago, that style being using period instruments, taking on the whole lively tempos. If the keyboard is involved, or indeed a solo instrument is involved, ornamenting more or less as we imagined that Mozart or whoever was playing the concerto or chamber music in question would have ornamented back in the 18th century. So an effort to reproduce the techniques and the sound world of the 18th century. But of course we don't have 18th century ears. And I mean, who knows exactly how much vibrato was used, who knows exactly what kind of tempos Mozart would have chosen, how much embellishment he would have added. No, that's all speculation.
Yeah. No, as I said earlier, the exercise is always necessarily imperfect, but still revelatory all the same.
Yeah, and I think even orchestras that use modern instruments for playing Mozart, which of course some still do, most now pay more than lip service to period performance practice in terms of articulation, you know, crisp articulation, shorter bow strokes, less vibrato, prominence of wind and brass, playing timpani with hard sticks, you know.
Yeah.
So they crack rather than boom. Yeah. it's a brave person. I mean, probably someone like Christian Thielmann might do it in Berlin to sort of reproduce the Karajan, Klemperer, even Bernstein sonorities. Those have probably gone to, really large orchestra, full fat Mozart, pretty well a thing of the past.
And to finish, and a fiendish question, I know, but can you choose just a few recordings of Mozart's music that stand out for you as particularly extraordinary, for whatever reason, repertoire, interpretation, collaboration, whatever it is, that you would encourage listeners to hear for themselves, with just a bit of an explanation as to why and what they should listen out for?
Yes. If we look at the symphonies, there's one maybe seemingly oddball recording that I would certainly direct people to. It's over 50 years old, but it still stands up brilliantly, and that is Benjamin Britten with the English Chamber Orchestra in Symphony No. 40, recorded in the Snape Maltings, 1968. Absolutely, a performance of blazing conviction. Still sounds modern. Okay, maybe the second movement, the Andante, is a little bit slower and a little bit more lovingly moulded than most people would do it nowadays. Britten was the first conductor on disc to take all the repeats and vindicate them. Mozart didn't write repeats by accident, but no one had done all the repeats in that symphony until Britten did. And it was also a very, very fine, blazing indeed, performance of the Prague Symphony, ditto with all repeats. So Mozart's 40th Symphony conducted by Britten, but a very fine indeed set of the late Mozart symphonies, 35, 36, 38, and then the last three, 39, 40, 41, from Charles Mackerras and the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, using a modern instrument chamber orchestra, playing with period, inverted commas, techniques, almost indistinguishable in sound world from a period band, and the brass rasping through, excitingly raw tone brass.
And that was a set on Linn.
Set on Linn, absolutely. It's won a lot of awards, with good
like
reason. I mean, it is. If you want a set of Mozart's last six symphonies, you just simply won't do better than that. Charles Mackerras, hugely experienced Mozartian. He was in his late 70s, early 80s when he made those recordings. A wise head, but an unerring feel for what worked in Mozart, and also the opera conductor. The opera conductor, the born opera composer, combining their wonderful theatre, those performances. So that's in terms of symphonies, I would definitely flag Britten and Charles Mackerras. Operas, yes, Idomeneo, which is a personal favourite of mine, the recording by John Eliot Gardner with Anthony Rolfe Johnson, both lyrical and heroic in the title role. That is for me the benchmark, absolutely revelatory, and he uses an impeccable text. Also includes Mozart's alternatives. There are lots and lots of alternative versions of Idomeneo, and quite a lot of recordings of mishmashes, but Eliot Gardner's scholarly, and you get all the music that Mozart wrote, but some of it as an appendix, with a first class cast and superb playing, and I'm pretty sure it's live as well, or at least made over 3 concert performances, so you do get a sense of theatre, of immediacy there. There's a wonderful recording of Die Entführung aus dem Serail with William Christie, made in the early 2000s, with Christina Schäfer, German soprano, as Constanza, and Ian Bostridge, young Ian Bostridge, as Belmonte. Carl Maria von Weber, the composer distantly related to Mozart through his wife, called Die Entführung the victory of youth in all its freshness, and in that William Christie recording it absolutely sounds it. Piano concertos, I would suggest that the recordings by Ronald Brautigam that have been appearing over the last 6 or 7 years on a period forte piano, even more imaginative than the series with Malcolm Bilson, John Eliot Gardner, I would highly recommend those. A sense of excited discovery. Again, it makes you reappraise the concertos in terms of the relationship between the keyboard and the orchestra. Keyboard, a very different beast from modern Bösendorfer or Steinway, and this sense of mischievous collusion between the two, which is such a crucial part of the piano concertos. That comes out, and the fantasy of Ronald Radicum's embellishments. So that's, and then one other opera recording, the René Jacobs Figaro. René Jacobs recorded all the late Mozart operas now, controversial. But I think the most successful for me have been Figaro and La Clemenza di Tito. Figaro, a wonderful sense of, again, freedom, and this delighted, cheeky sense that you're actually discovering the music for the first time. A marvellous woodwind section. The woodwind in Figaro, when all Mozart's mature operas, they are actors in themselves. They're members of the cast. In dramatic dialogue with singers, sometimes undercutting the singers, and a fabulous cast led by Lorenzo Regazzo and Patrizia Cioffi. Always very good to have Italians as the quick-witted servant pair, Susanna and Figaro. There, nothing like Italians in those roles. And we have Véronique Gens as the Countess and Simon Keenlyside as the Count. They're not bad either. So a real whiff of grease paint. You feel that Mozart would have given that performance the thumbs up. And the fantasy of the forte piano playing, which some people hate, adding sometimes facetious commentaries. It doesn't work so well, for example, in his recording of Idomeneo, but it works, to my thinking, brilliantly in Figaro.
Yeah. Well, some brilliant recommendations for listeners to go and hear. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Richard Wigmore. Hugely enjoyable. We've covered a lot of ground. But if you'd like to cover even more ground, just a reminder that Gramophone Presents Mozart, drawing on the finest writing about Mozart from our nearly century-long archive of Gramophone, is available to buy now. Just visit gramophone.co.uk for details of how to do that. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Martin.
Véronique Gens singing Porgy Amor from The Marriage of Figaro, conducted by René Jacobs and available on Harmonia Mundi, and one of the recommended recordings of Mozart's music chosen by our guest this week, Richard Wigmore. The excerpts you heard earlier in the podcast were also all from artists or works discussed. We began with the dramatic opening of Symphony No. 40, performed by Sir Charles Mackerras and the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, on that highly praised Linn recording of Mozart's final 4 symphonies. Next, we heard Alfred Brendel in the Piano Concerto K 271, Jeunehomme, also with Sir Charles Mackerras and the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, and that recording is available on Decca. This was followed by the Quatuor Ebène in the opening of String Quartet No. 19 in C major, K465, the Dissonant, and that's on Erato. Wolfgang Meyer, Nikolaus Harnoncourt and Concentus Musicus Wien then brought us the joyful close of the Clarinet Concerto on Teldec. And after that, an excerpt from the pioneering set of piano concertos from Malcolm Bilson and Sir John Eliot Gardiner, taken from the third movement of No. 27 in E-flat, K595, which was issued by Archive. Full details of all these recordings are available on our website, where you can also order a copy of Gramophone Presents Mozart, an exploration of Mozart's music as covered by Gramophone across almost a century. Finally, my thanks to you for downloading this Gramophone podcast. There are many more episodes to be found. Simply search for Gramophone where you usually find your podcasts. And if you enjoyed it, please do consider giving us a rating or even a review, as that can really help other people find our podcasts too. And as always, if you'd like to subscribe to the magazine, either in print or digitally, all listeners to our podcasts can get a 20% discount off any subscription package. Simply visit gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and enter the code podcast20 at the checkout. And do join us next week for another Gramophone podcast.